welcome to another Friday Classic hymn. Now, if you've ever said the words, God works in mysterious ways, you maybe thought that came from a Bible verse, but it's more likely it was inspired by today's Friday Classic hymn, which is God moves in a mysterious way. Not a hymn that I know, I had to learn it this week, but I did know the story because years ago I listened to John Piper tell the story of the man who wrote this song. His biography is beautiful and I encourage you to listen to it. I'll put the link below, but of course I'll share a short version in a few moments. A very profound hymn with a very sad background, but it remains popular and very meaningful to people today, especially those who are down and struggling and perhaps prone to depression. So do you know this hymn? If you have any stories to share about it, or if this hymn means something special to you, please share that in the comments below. Share where you've sung the song or what memories it brings to you. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, I would really appreciate if you would do that. So let's talk about this beautiful but tragic song. The man behind this classic hymn is William Cowper. He's got a W in his surname, but it's pronounced Cooper. He was one of the great poets of the 18th century, although he was known as Mad Cooper because he was terribly afflicted with depression, to the point that nobody knew what was wrong with him. He was admitted to an insane asylum later in his life because of this deep struggle of his. He was born into a pretty distinguished family in England, though. In 1731, he came into the world the son of a very distinguished minister who was a chaplain to King George II. His mother was actually a descendant of John Donne, the famous poet. But sadly, his mother died at 6 years old, and he wrote some very stirring works about his mother later on in his life. His father subsequently sent him to a boarding school, and here, it seems, his struggles began. He was very badly bullied. With no mother now and with a distant father, he started to become prone to deep depression. At the time, it was known as melancholy. There was no real knowledge of depression in those days except this melancholy which would afflict people. And once he'd left school, these bouts of depression became worse. He qualified as a lawyer and worked for a while as a lawyer, but then his dad got him a position as a government law man. And this just totally pushed him over the edge. The pressure of this position he was supposed to take was too much for him, and Cowper had his first major bout with depression at that point, just before he was supposed to start this job, and had a complete breakdown. And after that, he never really worked again. He was in and out of institutions and cared for by different people as he tried to live his life. There are different accounts of suicide attempts, but God had a plan for his life, it seems, because he kept being spared. And it was in the 1760s that he actually came to faith. At this point, Cowper was recovering from a very bad bout of depression at St. Albans Asylum. And he was under the care of a doctor who was a Christian, Dr. Nathaniel Cotton. Cotton preached the gospel to him. And eventually Cowper placed his faith in Christ and became a Christian, and this changed his life in many ways. His depression and his fight against depression, shall I say, took on a whole new angle as he knew himself to be a child of God. A little while later, he became friends with John Newton, who was famously the hymn writer of Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound. I've already covered John Newton's story in my Amazing Grace Friday Classic hymn. And these two became very close, and Newton provided great pastoral care for this struggling man. He would take William Cowper with him as he visited his congregation. And a few years later, when he was putting together a hymnal, John Newton asked Cowper to write some hymns. And God Works in a Mysterious Way was one of the hymns that was published in this hymnal, Olney Hymns, in the 1770s. Now, there are some stories that he wrote this just after a suicide attempt, and others say just before. Nobody is quite sure what the truth is. But he obviously wrote it when he was in a good place, because there's some encouraging words, as we shall see. But the sad thing is that Cowper really struggled with himself all the way until he died, and in fact, according to many sources, believed himself to have been lost. Cowper was a Calvinist. His view of the faith had been very influenced by George Whitefield rather than John Wesley, the two sort of main theologians of the day. Whitefield was a Calvinist who believed God predestined his elect for salvation, whereas Wesley favored more, you have the responsibility to say yes to God's offer. But being a Calvinist, Cowper would start convincing himself time and again that he was not elect and that he was damned. And he couldn't seem to shake this, and this, in the end, seemed to really affect his depression. And most people believe that he died in a state of great despair because he believed himself to be damned. However, some others believe that he came right in the end, and some have got his final words as being these: "I am not shut out of heaven after all." We're not sure if that's true or not. But what a tragic life and what a sad situation. But out of it came some beautiful hymns. And this hymn in particular gained popularity because people all over the place recognized how true these words are. In fact, there's a story in the 1840s of a man who had to lay off a bunch of workers from his mill. And his daughter was there while he was doing this, and as the workers began to feel sad at what had happened, she started to sing one of the lines of this song and gave them courage as they faced this terrible thing in their lives. I think in the end it shows how God can use even darkness and struggle and sadness for good, because Cowper is still widely loved and regarded as a great hymn writer, despite his great struggles. You can read a lot about him online, and as I said, John Piper's biography of him is very well worth the listen or the read. So let's take a look at the words that he wrote for this beautiful song. Verse 1, God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. As I said earlier, a lot of people have that phrase in their mind, God works in mysterious ways, and this is where it comes from. Cowper wrote that in his struggles, that God is mysterious and you can't understand him. And isn't that true? As much as he has revealed all that we need for salvation, there are mysteries that we don't understand about God. He performs these wonders, and somehow he's just so far above us. I mean, he did say in his word that his ways are not our ways. And so there's always that element of mystery in our faith as God does what he does. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Now, of course, that's a metaphor for the storms of life, the seas. If you think of Jesus walking the sea, God does that in our lives, doesn't he? As the storms rage, Jesus walks across the stormy seas and calms the storms. Thank God for his mysterious ways and his wonders to ride the storms and help us through them. Verse 2 says, deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. So his unfathomable ways and designs are beautiful and bright, but they're deep and we can't understand them. But we trust in his sovereign will. And that last line there is very important in William Cowper's thinking. God will do what God will do, and we can trust him to do what is right. And he believed that. He believed that God sovereignly did whatever he wanted to do, and we need to accept it. It reminds me of Romans 8, where Paul says that God uses all things for the good of those who love him. He uses all things, and so we don't understand, but his ways are skillful, never failing, and in the end bright. And in his sovereignty, he makes good things come out of even bad things, though we can't fathom it at the time. Verse 3 is the one that the young girl sang to the workers who'd just been laid off. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. That is very profound. Cowper was saying when you're feeling fearful, and he much of the time was, take courage. And Jesus obviously says that to the disciples as he was walking across the waters to them on the storm. Take courage, he said, it is I. And so you and I can take courage as we face our fears. And this is why, because the clouds that we are dreading actually have great mercy in them, and they'll break in blessings on your head. So as the clouds break, though we may be fearing what's going on, God is bringing blessings even through the storms. Isn't that profound, friends? And maybe you need that today. Maybe you're facing storms and big clouds, and you need to be reminded that God's mercy will rain down on you and bless you even as you face a storm. So take courage, take courage. Verse 4 says, judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. So don't judge him by your own understanding. You aren't going to understand what he's doing. Just trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. And so though there seems to be a frowning, if you look at your situation, and again, think of Cowper and his deep depression. He thought that God may have been frowning on the world and on him. But he said, behind what seems to be a frown, there's a smile. God is doing what's good. Not that God's taking pleasure in our pain. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, though we can't see it, God is doing good. And so he smiles as he sees the good that he is bringing about. We can trust him for this. Friends, whatever you're going through, don't judge it by your own feeble understanding, but trust God for his grace and trust him that he will be doing good. He is doing good in all your situations. Verse 5 is another beautiful picture. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. So think of a piece of fruit that isn't ripe yet. You need to wait for it to be ripe before you eat it. And it's the same with our struggles. You know, God is bringing about his purposes, but they have to ripen. And we can't rush them. They're unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. And so they don't taste so great as they're ripening. But when they flower in the end, it's going to be a sweet tasting joy to see how God has used your bitterness to bring about good. This is heavy stuff, friends. It takes faith to understand what he's talking about here. And that's how he ends the song by saying, blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. So if you're unbelieving, you're going to look at his works and just throw up your hands in despair and say there can't be a God, right? Because of look at the pain in this life. But that's a mistake. That's an error. God is his own interpreter. And so in the end, God does what God does, and we need to trust him. And he will make it plain. And friends, maybe this is what you need to hold on to today, that you will understand one day why God did what he did and allowed what he did. Of course, there's the two schools of thought. There are the determinists who believe God has determined everything, and that's where Cowper found himself. Everything that happens, God has caused it to happen, even sin. That's what the Calvinist view is. God even causes people to sin because in his sovereignty, he is working things for good. Me, I fall on the kind of Wesleyan, Arminian, free will side, where I believe God grants us true free will, but in his sovereignty uses our free will, even if we choose evil of our own volition, and uses it for good in the end. So there's the two different views, and I don't know which one you are favoring, but in the end, we're still brothers and sisters despite these differences. The point is, God will still use all things for good for those who love him. And one day he will make it plain how he did that when we meet him in glory. So what words spoke to you today, my friends, as we heard these hard but meaningful words? What thoughts do you have to share? Please pop them in the comments below and let's talk. And let's sing it together now. We're going to sing it to the most popular tune, which is Dundee. This is from the old Scottish Psalter hymnal in the 1600s and is the most common tune for this song. Thank you for your support, by the way. So many of you support me on Patreon, and Patreon supporters get free downloads of all my music, including all these Friday Classic hymn recordings and the piano in the background that you hear. Thank you for kindly supporting the work I do online. I'm very grateful. Sing it with me, and let's just glory in the God who is mysterious but can be trusted.
God moves in a mysterious way, His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, He treasures up His bright designs and works His sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust Him for His grace. Behind the frowning providence, He hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan His work in vain. God is His own interpreter, and He will make